Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for welcoming us. So, I want to tell you a little bit of a personal story today. And maybe you all are familiar with some family or friends, or maybe even you yourself have gotten interested in the DNA craze, as far as whether it's 23andMe or Ancestry.com or what have you. And that can be fun and really interesting, very informative, but sometimes you can get a little bit more than you bargained for. And that is the case with my family. So let me explain. No, there's too much. Let me sum up. All right, so my mom, Mary, she and her brother were adopted very young by Don and Norma. And they always knew that they had been adopted, but because it was a closed proceeding, they really didn't know much else about their family. But then when DNA testing came along, my mom decided to check it out and find out what she could find out. And she did learn some things. Her birth parents were Zane and Lois, and Zane was the son of, I guess, my great-grandpa, Orwin. And based on the stories that we were able to put together, we figure that he may or may not have been part of the Chicago Mafia back in the old days. And then his son Zane didn't really fall that far from the family tree, as he was known to get in a little bit of trouble with the law, did some time in prison at least once. But the interesting thing about him is that despite having spent time in prison, nowhere in the world is there a record of a Social Security number for him, which seems kind of odd, right? That you could get processed in and out without one. And so we have put together this scenario in our minds whereby Zane had eventually had a change of heart about his wicked ways, turned state's evidence and joined witness protection, and then, hopefully lived happily ever after. Now, at this time, he would be very, very old, but we do imagine that there is a possibility that at some point on his deathbed, he will decide to ditch his security detail and go and find his long-lost kids for a family reunion. And so we hold out that hope. The last thing that my mom had learned was that she did actually have a half-brother that she never knew about. And his name is Louis, and we all got to meet him one Christmas, although sadly no one has heard from him in about a year or so, so we hope that he's doing well, but I guess nobody really knows. Now, moving on to my dad's side, 'cause it's actually even more interesting. And really, we did not have to go into the DNA testing at all to find the interesting parts, or some of them, of my dad's family story. You see, I always grew up with my grandma Dolores, who was my dad's mom, as well as the mom to his 3 siblings. And then there was Grandpa Norvold, who we didn't know very well. He was Grandma's first husband and father to all 4 of her kids, including my dad. But they divorced when everybody was young, and my dad was like 4. So he was around, but not super present. And what we know about him is that he was kind of an anti-government conspiracy theorist, sort of before it was cool to be one, if you know what I mean. And also he died young of a heart problem, and so he exits the story fairly quickly for us. However, Grandma married Grandpa Bill, so he was there for our whole existence and most of my dad's, and so he was our main grandpa on that side. We weren't super close, and I remember thinking that like maybe it was because he always just sort of seemed really old for some reason. But then as I learned more after I was growing up, I realized that the reason he seemed so old was because he was just really old. like 25 years older than my grandma old. A little bit creepy, you know? So that was Grandpa Bill, but the thing was, he was also on his second marriage, and his first marriage had followed a more traditional timeline in which he had 2 kids, Patty and Peter, and they, because of all that age difference, were essentially the same age as their stepmom, which was also awkward. And we knew Patty and her husband and their 3 kids growing up, and they would always, like every summer or 2, would have all of us out to their lake house for a potluck. And we knew it was a family get-together always, but as kids, we didn't really know or realize how they were kin to us. Like, you know, Patty was our aunt, and the cousins were cousins, but it was kind of like in the kind of way how, you know, some cultures, it's like everyone who's older than you and not your mom is your auntie, you know? And so we just thought we were just calling them that, but in the end, it turned out that was actually accurate because Patty was actually my dad's stepsister, even though she was old enough to be his mom, and all of our cousins actually were our cousins, even though they were old enough to be our moms. So at our young age, the math just wasn't really mathing for us that way, and so we never realized until probably the last decade or so how everybody was related. So if we now then take that, all of that was known prior to the DNA testing. So then we've got to get into Grandma Dolores' family history. And it's important to know about Grandma before I go into the details that one thing about her was that she was super proud of her heritage, and that was the heritage of a black Swede, which probably most of you have never heard of. And in retrospect, it may not exist. But as the family lore goes, back in the old days and in the old country, there was a group of Spaniards who invaded Sweden, and that invasion encompassed the land and also the ladies, if you get my drift. And the resulting stock was not exactly the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Swede that you might expect normally. It was darker hair, brown eyes, darker skin. And so that was something she was very proud of. Well, imagine her surprise and chagrin when her DNA test came back and she was 17% indigenous North American. From Baja, mind you, nowhere near Sweden or Spain. And so she was not at all happy about learning this. And so when people started trying to figure out how this had all happened, they had to begin to reflect on, you know, some of the things that crazy Aunt Flo used to say. That was Grandma's Aunt Flo. And everybody just kind of dismissed her out of hand because, you know, she didn't make any sense and she was crazy. But it turns out she wasn't really all that crazy. So what seems to have happened is Gertrude, that's my grandma's mom. She and her sister Florence were raised in Chicago. And Gertrude did spend a little bit of time in New York at one point. She had run off there or what have you. But her mom went to New York, retrieved her, and brought her home. And once she was back in Chicago, she got a job working at a boarding house there. And whilst working at the boarding house, she met and struck up a liaison with one of the boarders there. You know the type, tall, dark, and handsome, the type that might come out in a DNA test as roughly 34% Native American. And nobody knows anything more about him, sadly. We don't know his name or whether he was on his way east or on his way back home when he stopped in Chicago. We don't know if he knew about my grandma. We don't know if he ever had another family. I picture this poor guy living out a real-life version of the movie Coco, just wandering around purgatory, hoping someone will remember him and put him on their ofrenda before he disappears from all history. But alas, if he had any family, they have not yet gotten into the DNA testing, so we'll just have to wait till they do. Grandma, like I said, felt somewhat deceived and betrayed by this whole thing, and that betrayal was not improved at all when she began to receive friend requests from family back east in New York. And I'm not talking about distant cousin family. I'm talking about half-sibling level relations here. And so they started putting more pieces back together. And I guess that what happened was when Gertrude ran off to New York and her mom came and retrieved her and brought her home, it was not before she had had a chance to start a family of her own there. So nobody knows if she came back against her will or of her own volition or what. But again, Grandma was not amused. And so, if I have done this right, and that's a big if, and if you've been following along, I believe that I have referenced in this story 4 great-grandparents, 7 grandparents, 11 miscellaneous aunts, uncles, and cousins, which comes to 22, and me makes 23, hence the title of my story. Thank you.